Good evening, gentlemen. We are beginning tonight, with the help of God, the 9th chapter of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. 9th out of 10. We're making good progress, and some of the sweetest and most interesting and juiciest parts, good evening, of the second part of Tanya are here at the end. In our previous episode, in last week's episode, in chapter 8, we asked the question, can we understand the way God is united with his traits? Can we understand how God has wisdom, and God has will, and God has kindness, and yet God is absolutely simple? And the answer was, no, we can't understand. We can't understand. The Alter Rebbe immediately goes on and says, but why can't we understand? Which is very interesting and generally good advice in life, that even once we realize we can't understand, it's worthwhile asking, but why can't we understand? And this leads to a whole different level of knowledge, a negative knowledge, which we spoke about previously and we will speak about again in this class, knowing what we cannot know, right? So you don't know what you can't know until you know why you can't know it, right? So we only know that we can't understand God's simplicity despite his various traits when we investigate why we can't understand this simplicity. Why can't we understand that God is simple with all of his traits? And the Alter Rebbe explained in chapter 8 very directly. He said, because all of the traits that are ascribed to God in the Torah, when we call God kind, or we call God wise, or we say that Hashem is the one who has a will. All of these descriptions, as we understand them, are metaphors applied from how these things are, good evening, to human beings. In other words, we really only know his chachma, really anything we know. It's not just about Hashem. The truth is, in everything, how do we know what things are? By comparing them to what they are in our experience, what we have. How do we know God's wisdom? From our wisdom. The only wisdom we have for comparison, the only thing we know to be wisdom, is human wisdom. However, since what Hashem has that is called wisdom is totally unlike our wisdom, therefore, we do not know, number one, we do not know his wisdom. Number two, we do not know him, which is kind of a given, right? That we've spoken about already many times, and we don't know him. And number three, if we don't know his wisdom, because his wisdom is not like ours, and we don't know him because he is totally beyond being known, then how could we know how he and his wisdom are not two things but really one thing? We don't know any part of the equation. We don't know him, we don't know his wisdom, and we don't know how the two are an absolutely simple unity, that the two things are actually not two things at all, but rather one thing in utter simplicity. Right? So the short answer to the question, why don't we know, why don't we understand God's simplicity, is that the traits which have to be part of that simplicity that God has are incomparable to the traits that we have. They are not anything, they are not comparable to anything in our experience, and therefore we don't understand. And we went through the various traits at the end of chapter 8 in last week's class, the various traits that a human being has. We started at chachma, which is the highest, wisdom, which is the highest trait of a human being has, and generally speaking, the highest thing that we can understand in our universe, in our world as human beings, is chachma, is wisdom. And we went through all of the various traits as we moved down from wisdom, and we showed how every level of trait, every level of human experience depends totally on the one that comes before it, right? We explained how if you can't have chachma, which is the existence of this thing before me, that I'm standing before it and seeing its light, that I'm seeing this thing, if I can't see it, then how can I approach it and begin to understand it with Bina? And if I don't have the involvement of Bina, if I'm not so involved and it hasn't become part of my own mind in a way of Bina, then how can I make it personal? How can I make it real to me in a way of Das? And if it's not real to me in a way of das, how can I relate to it as wanting to move closer to it or wanting to move away from it, like we have in the emotional traits, in the middos, right? And if I don't have love or fear, how can I have machshava? How can I have thought? Because all action that is that is in relation, all thought which is in relation to a thing that's outside of me is based and is motivated by either in my desire to move toward the thing or my desire to move away from the thing. And we explained so too, dibur, how can I externalize an action if I don't first have the action by myself? So speech is totally dependent on thought. And we said, action, how can that self-expression become totally separate from me if it's not first in a state of relation to other things? So action requires speech, right? And at every level we discussed how even though sometimes you appear to have some of these things without the others, for example, someone can think about doing something and then do it without seeming to speak in between, right? People act without speaking. That was our prime example. And we explained that the way action depends on speech is not in a way of actually requiring speech in actuality. In other words, it depends on the essence of speech, on what speech is. If there is nothing, if you don't have what speech is, which is an action, externalizing action directed toward another, then how can you have the actual physical action which totally takes place outside of the person, right? That was our example, and we explained that at every level. And what was the point of that whole discussion of the human nature, of the human soul and all of its faculties? The whole point of the discussion was to show how everything with which we are familiar in human life derives from Chachma, which is really the ability to see in the deepest spiritual sense other things, right? It's really our ability to be in the light, to be enlightened by, to see realities outside of ourselves. That is the deepest thing in human experience. And everything else in human experience derives from that. We were therefore setting up at the end of chapter 8 for the beginning of chapter 9 that we're going to do tonight, God willing. Because now that we have explained how the highest thing in human experience is Chachma, is this experience of wisdom, this experience of deep mental intuition or perception, we are now going to explain how God is totally beyond Chachma. In other words, we are going back and explain what the Alter Rebbe said very briefly, that what God has, we don't have what God has, and everything that He has we understand only in light of our own experience, which very much limits us. We are now we're explaining that at greater length. So first, Alter Rebbe explained at the end of chapter 8 what our experience is, basically, as souls in this earth, from Chachma down to action. And now we are going to, in chapter 9, explain how none of this is comparable to God. God does not have anything comparable to these things as we have them in us. So let's read the beginning of chapter 9, in the English on 950, obviously, the Hebrew, the beginning of the chapter. Let's read. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe, Aval lagabe HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but in relation to the Holy One, blessed be He, Madregas HaChachma, the level of Chachma, the level of wisdom, Shehi Tchilas Machshava V'Reishisa, which is the beginning of thought and its genesis, as we explained last week, that Chachma is the highest. It is the beginning. All thought springs ultimately from Chachma. He seif maise etzloi. To God, this level of wisdom, as we have described it, is seif maise, which means the end of His action, right? Which is a quote, which is a partial quote of what? Soif Maisa b'machshava tchila. The end of his action was in his thought at first. The Alter Rebbe is borrowing that language to use here. So Chachma, the highest thing in the human experience, wisdom, the wisdom that is the highest thing that the soul can experience is to God like Soif Maisa, which means the very bottom of this process, the last step that we described last week. So to God, what is highest to us is to God the exact same as what is lowest to us. Again, what is highest to us is to God the same as what is lowest to us. To him, that there is no distinction between Chachma, wisdom, and Maisa, the actual action, which is the lowest of all human expressions. To him, they're equal.
Why? Because he has no time?
He's going to explain. He's going to explain why. Dahainu. That is to say, Shenechshavas keilu hi bechinas umadregas asiya lagabe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In relation to Hashem, wisdom is considered as if it was a state and a level of action. Kedichsiv, third line on 950, Kulam b'chachma asisa. As the verse famously says in Tehillim, Kulam b'chachma asisa. You have made all of them with wisdom. And the famous, the implicit question on the pasuk of Kulam b'chachma asisa, which means the simple meaning is you have made all of them with wisdom. But the implicit question is that this pasuk really gives rise, like in other psukim that we find mentioned in the Gemara or explained elsewhere, this pasuk gives rise to the possibility that it's actually chachma that creates. Right? In other words, kulam b'chachma asisa, they were all created with wisdom. You could come to the erroneous conclusion that it is actually wisdom rather than God, right? And with wisdom merely as a vessel. That it is wisdom actually that creates everything, right? So in other words, the implicit question is, why would the pasuk must be trying to tell us something by saying, with wisdom you have made them, or with wisdom you have acted, because there's room to make a mistake from this pasuk. So it must be teaching us something important, right? And the Chassidic answer to what this pasuk is teaching us is that Chachma and Asiya are the same to God. To God, wisdom and action are the same. Wisdom is like an action to him. He relates to it at the distance of wisdom.
But God doesn't have anything which is not chokhmah. So why do God is all about wisdom. He doesn't lack any wisdom. So why is it even mentioned akol b'chokhmah? I would understand akol b'kedushatcha asita. Why does it need even to say akol b'chokhmah asita?
What do you mean? There's other traits that God has. God has chesed, kulam b'chastecha asisa.
Ulam chesed ibaneh.
Right.
Ulam gvurascha asisa.
Because it's like, who are we to tell that, God did it in wisdom? Of course he did it with wisdom.
I don't know. Ask David HaMelech. David HaMelech wrote the Tehillim with prophecy. That's the only answer I have to that question. Who are we? We are no one. But thankfully we have David HaMelech's help.
So we can blame him?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I blame, in general, everything taught in this class is blamed on the Alter Rebbe and Rabbi Yoel Kahn. None of it's my fault, in general.
On a positive way.
I hope if you were relying on me as an authority about these things, really you should have your head checked. You have more immediate problems than
it's recorded.
You have more immediate. No, don't say anything that the whole internet doesn't know already. So it says kulam b'chachma asisa to teach us that chachma for Hashem is like asiya, is like an action, and we're going to discuss what exactly that means and the implication of that idea. We're going to explain it at length. Let's continue reading. V'hainu loymar, that is to say, says the Alter Rebbe, sheke'erech hachayos sheba'asiya gufonis v'gashmias le'erech chayos hachachma. wisdom is relative to the life force in physical creation, physical and bodily creation. Sorry, again. Just as is the relation of the life force in the physical and the bodily, in comparison to the life force of what is within Chachma, right? In other words, just like when we look at the world around us, the Alter Rebbe is saying, David HaMelech Pashat saying, a metaphor. How do we wrap our heads around the extent to which God is beyond Chachma, right? We said God is beyond wisdom. What does that mean? The Alter Rebbe is explaining. Here's how you understand it. This is what you think about to grasp the extent to which Hashem is beyond wisdom. You think about how far is wisdom beyond action in our world, right? For example, you have the idea of kindness. Kindness is a thing, right? Chesed. There is a thing called chesed. The thing called chesed you can grasp with your chachma. Your mind, your wisdom can understand what kindness is. And obviously, there's infinite levels to kindness, many different kinds, many different expressions, all sorts of nuances, right? There's a whole world, right? All of love really is in the spheres, in Kabbalah, is related to chesed and kindness, right? It's an infinite concept, something you could speak about, something you could relate to infinitely at length, is kindness. Right? And our chachma can grasp kindness at various levels. Maybe there's levels of chachma we can't grasp, but at some level our minds can grasp what is kindness in the deepest sense, right? That's chachma. Putting a penny in the tzedakah box 1 second of one morning of your life is an action that reflects kindness, right? If you trace it all the way back, ideally, right, if the human being is working correctly, if the soul is all connected, as we discussed last week, sometimes there are disconnects and things don't work as they should. Things are misordered, so to speak. But if you are ordered and working as a human being can work, right, you should be able to trace that action all the way back to your chachma perception of the idea of kindness, right? Now, the fact that it's a mitzvah means that there's other concerns because we don't do it because it's kindness, we do it because Hashem says so, etc., etc. Really, that just strengthens the point I'm making, doesn't weaken it. I'm just trying to bring out a point that the single coin, the single act of putting the coin in a tzedakah box, 1 second of your entire life, compared to the idea of kindness, which, by the way, is undying and eternal relative to human beings, right? When does kindness die? When does kindness, the concept, get old, right? You understand what I'm saying? It's eternal, unchanging, infinite in a very real way, in a very real sense. So just as you're putting a coin in a tzedakah box, 1 second of your life is compared to the infinite reality of kindness, so is the relationship of chachma itself. In other words, all the chachmas, everything that chachma can perceive, human chachma and spiritual chachma, angelic chachmas, the chachma in the world of Atzilus, all the chachmas, all the wisdoms, everything that wisdom can perceive, all together is like the one coin in the tzedakah box in compared to what God is. That's the metaphor the Alter Rebbe is saying. So to God, chachma, not a chachma, right? But chachma, the whole realm of chachma, everything that can be known with chachma, which really, as the Alter Rebbe is going to say in a moment, includes everything below chachma, right? Because everything below chachma is included within chachma. If chachma can know kindness, obviously it can know putting a coin in the tzedakah box, right? So everything below chachma is included within chachma. So everything in wisdom, everything in our universe which derives from wisdom, which is all the entire human experience and everything that we relate to, essentially, all of that is compared to what God is, like us putting one coin in the tzedakah box is compared to the idea, the chachma of kindness. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. That's the erech, that's the relative distance between Hashem and wisdom. Wisdom as a whole. As he goes on to explain, what is wisdom? So the last line of 950. It is the beginning and source of the life force in a person and all of the physical creatures. Shehu ka'ayin, which is which that's what Chachma is, right? And now the Alter Rebbe goes through the steps. He says, Shehu ka'ayin. How small, how insignificant is a single physical action? It is as nothing legabe chayus shebe'osios hadibur, in comparison to the life force that is within speech. In other words, those who are here in last week's class know that not only is the action nothing in compared to Chachma, but the truth is that a single action is nothing even in compared to speech about the action. Right? Because speech is at an infinite remove. All action is totally dependent on speech, right? Not actually speaking, I have to mention again, because I know it confuses people, it confuses me as well. Not actually speaking. But the idea is all external soul expressions, which is what action is, asiya, right? An external soul expression. I take a coin which is outside of me and I put it in a tzedakah box which is outside of me. An externally directed action, right? All externally directed actions depend on my soul's ability to express to another, right? In other words, before you can be external, before the soul can express externally, its expression has to at least be directed outward. So external expression is action. Outward expression is dibur, is speech. So, in other words, what he's saying is, action is a subset of dibur. Action is really, you can't think of, it's always tricky when you're talking about the 10 spheres or the 10 aspects of the soul. You can't think of them as 10 separate things, right? The way Chassidus and Kabbalah explain them, they're very much internested, one included within the other in many, many, many different ways, right? Really in an infinite way. They're all inter-included, they're all interfaceted with one another, they're all intertwined, right? So we're focusing now on one aspect which says that action is really nothing other than an extension of speech. Speech is the soul's ability to turn outward. Action is when the expression actually completely leaves us and is outside.
But it's like completely two different levels. Like you talk about chokhmah, and then you talk about, action of putting the tzedakah.
Yeah.
It's like, it's like, a steak and, bread.
That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. So there's two aspects, right? We spoke about this last week as well. I should have brought it up earlier, actually. There's two aspects. On the one hand, the lower level is totally dependent on the higher level. On the other hand, as he said here, it's ka'ayin lagabav. It's as nothing compared to it, right? So it's totally dependent, but also totally separate, right? Which is something that's only possible in a way of yesh ma'ayin, of creation something from nothing. Which is what you're saying. That's what makes them totally separate. So in other words, you're right. Speech and action are completely separate. And if you want a demonstration, right, go talk to a wall and make it fall down, right, for example, right?
No, even by yourself, you can speak about one thing, about what you're going to do, and you can still...
That's also true. Yeah, that's also true. That's true. Another good point. So they're totally separate one from the other. Right? They're shaloi be'erech, they're incommensurate. Like you said, it's like a steak and a piece of bread. They have what's the connection, right? On the other hand, the lower one is totally dependent on the higher one. And both of these things are true. Yeah? That's really what Bria Yesh Ma'ayin is. Bria Yesh Ma'ayin is that the created thing depends, the creation ex nihilo, creation something from nothing, is that the created thing depends entirely on the thing that creates it, and yet the thing that creates it is totally removed from the thing that's created. That's really what creation, something from nothing, is. As we discussed earlier in Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, what seems like ages ago.
It was ages ago.
It's all relative. What's the Alter Rebbe saying? The Alter Rebbe is saying that action compared to speech is as nothing, right? Just to speech, never mind chachma, right? To speech, the level immediately preceding it, the action basically doesn't count. It doesn't enter that realm. You can act all day and it doesn't change what's happening in the realm of speech, and vice versa, right? So action is as nothing compared to speech, and he goes further. Shehu and speech, ka'ayin lagabe chayes shebe'etzes hamachshava. Speech in turn is absolutely nothing compared to thought. Same relationship. Sorry?
Speech is dibur.
Speech, dibur, yeah. Speech is there's nothing to thought. Second line of 951. Shehu ka'ayin lagabe chayus u'mailas hamidah shemehem nimshach hamachshava zu. Which thought in turn is absolutely nothing compared to the life force and the level of the emotions from which thought derives. In other words, very beautifully, the Alter Rebbe, the last chapter, worked down this whole system, and now he's working back up it, and he's saying he worked down from Chachma to Maaseh, to action, and now he's saying, and when you work back up, you see that Maaseh is a nothing in comparison to Dibur, and Dibur is nothing in comparison to Machshava, speech is nothing in comparison to thought, and thought is nothing in comparison to the Midas, the love and fear, and the other emotions which create it. Shehu, continues Alter Rebbe, third line on 951, Ka'ayin l'gabe chayis u'mailus u'madregas ha'chachma bina v'das, is as nothing compared to the life and the level of chachma bina das, of the mind. Makar amidos, which is the source of the emotions. Kain mamash, says the Alter Rebbe, erach madregas u'mailus ha'chachma, shireishus u'makar ha'chayis shebekol ha'olamus, so too, literally, is the relative level and quality of chachma, of wisdom, which is the beginning and the source of life in all the worlds, as we said before, in comparison to God in His glory and His essence. So the Alter Rebbe has now given us a contemplation, something to think about. To what extent is God greater than Chachma? God is greater than Chachma the same way that a single action is incommensurate to Chachma itself, which goes through many levels, right? Really, a single action is nothing even compared to speech, which is nothing even commensurate to thought, which is nothing even in light of emotion, which is nothing in light of the intellect, which the highest level of which is Chachma. Right? So how much of a nothing is a single act compared to Chachma? It's a nothing, 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 nothing. Right? That's how many nothings it is. Right? That's how many times nothing it is. So too is the relationship of Chachma, the source of all the worlds. In other words, what are we really saying? We're really saying, so too is God's Chachma. Right? I don't want to overcomplicate things too much. We're going to get more into that. But just to plant the seeds of the idea, when we say the wisdom that is the source of all the worlds, what do we mean? We mean the divine wisdom, right? Which complicates things. We'll get much more into that. I just want to plant the seed of the idea now. But so too is God infinitely higher than wisdom, than Chachma. To that extent, to that measure. That's what Alter Rebbe is saying. Oh, Rabbi Yoel points out, I forgot to mention, that the Alter Rebbe says not just is Chachma to Hashem like an Maaseh, like an action, but it's Soif Maaseh, which means the end of action, the lowest action. In fact, Chassidus explains that Soif Maaseh, which means the end of action, really refers to the end result of your action. Right? So it's not just the Chachma, wisdom is not just as far from God as putting the coin in the tzedakah box, it's as far from God as the coin lying in the tzedakah box once you've already left. Right? It's even that one step further, Soif Maaseh, it's the end of the action. That's how distant God's wisdom is from Him. Right? Now remember, the entire purpose of this entire discussion, of these 3 chapters that we're in, is to explain how God and His wisdom are absolutely one. Just remember. Right?
And He's also beyond time.
What? Beyond time? I'm not sure. Why does beyond time matter?
Because, what's the difference with the beginning of Maaseh and the Sof Maaseh? For Him it's the same.
Oh, I'm not sure if Sof Maaseh means in time. I think Sof Maaseh means in Madrega.
The result.
Madrega. In level, right?
But there's a difference between Atchalat Maaseh and Siyum Maaseh.
Nachon, but it's not Hatchalat v'Siyum b'Zman. It's Hatchalat v'Siyum b'Madrega. It's causative, right? You need one to get to the next. It's not in time.
But he doesn't need.
What?
He doesn't need one to do the other.
No, well, he doesn't need anything is the truth. But the
like when he created Deshe. At one time, boom, there was Deshe. He didn't say, okay, let's make paint it first and then, do the rest. It's like...
But he said, and then it happened.
Right, but
So it's a process.
No. Soif Maisa, listen, Rabbi Say. There is a process. It's Chachma, it goes through all of these steps. The creation of the world goes through all of these steps. I should just say outright. It's not really what we're talking about. You don't need to know that. Soif Maisa, you don't need to know that to understand this anyway, I don't think. But Soif Maisa, when we say the end of the action, we mean that if he is going to be acting in a way, right, where there is an action, right, then the action perforce, necessarily, must be that the action has at least two aspects. It has an aspect where it is involved with him, right? And then it has an aspect where he is done performing the action, not in time, where the action becomes separate from him, right? Where it's not him doing the action. That's not the aspect of the action we're talking about, but the action, so to speak, as it is in fruition, separate from him. Does he create a world separate from him? The answer is yes, he does create a world separate from him, whatever that means. And once the object or the creation is finished being made, right? Like I said, like the coin that's already in the tzedakah box, right? So to speak. Once it becomes separate even from your action, that's Soif Maisa. Soif Maisa. That's just a side note.
Difficult because in one hand we say, God is like, this is like everything is God. Before and after there was no change with God.
Yes.
So anyway, let's continue.
What do you?
Because there's no difference. If you look in the eyes of God, you should say that before and after, and whatever is going to come even after, it's the same thing.
Nachon. In other words, you've already, here's the problem with learning chapter 9 of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, because you already got rid of all the worlds back in chapter 4, right? There's nothing exists really. So what are we even doing anymore?
Nothing exists and everything exists.
No. It's too hasty in my opinion. Too hasty. In other words, you have to learn carefully. We haven't thrown everything away. On the contrary, actually, the very fact that we're discussing his wisdom should be the first hint that is not so simple. It's not so simple. In other words, well, nothing's ever simple, I know. But this even more so. This even more so than usual. Even more so than the base level of it's not so simple. Because God's chachma, the very fact that we're calling God's chachma by a name, right? And we're having this strange back and forth where in order to explain that it's totally one with him, we're explaining that he's totally and infinitely above it, right? Which you go figure that out, right? The very fact that that's the discussion we're having should tell you that not everything is just God, right? There's a little more subtlety, right? That's not what the Alter Rebbe is aiming at. That's not what the Alter Rebbe is trying to say. Anyway, let's continue a little bit further. Yeah, let's continue. Second line of 952. I'm on. Alter Rebbe continues about God. He says, "Hambereimim v'hamisnase ribui revaves madregas remimus yosem remimus madregas hachachma al bechinas chayes sheba'asiyah." And in truth, says the Alter Rebbe, even our metaphor doesn't really work. In other words, our metaphor in which we're saying God is as far from wisdom as wisdom is from a single action, the truth is that even that metaphor is insufficient. The Alter Rebbe says, because God is exalted myriads of degrees, myriads of myriads, tens of thousands of degrees from the exaltedness of Chachma over Asiyah. In other words, God is really much farther from wisdom than wisdom is from action. He is even farther than we've been discussing. Because in our metaphor, the distance of wisdom to action is only at 5 removes of Yesh Ma'ayin, which you'd think one would be enough for anyone, but apparently not, right? It's only at 5 levels of something from nothing, removed from wisdom, right? Action is at an infinite remove from speech, which is at an infinite remove from thought, which is at an infinite remove from emotions, which is at an infinite remove from... I didn't start with the first one. Yeah, I skipped the first one. Which is at an infinite remove from seichel, from intellect, right? Which chachma is the highest part of. So we only have 5 infinite removes from action to wisdom. Shehein madregas bechinas asiya v'dibur machshava midas v'seichel. These are the action, which are the levels of action, speech, thought, emotion, and mind. Right, are our 5 levels of remove. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but God, the Holy One, blessed be He, Ramu Misnase, is high and exalted, Madregas HaChachma, above the level of wisdom, Revavas Madregas Ke'elu Ad Ein Kates, by infinite myriads of such degrees, infinite tens of thousands of such removes is God's remove from Chachma. Right? So in other words, that whole metaphor is really, right, and this is the Chap, the Alter Rebbe, this is what the Alter Rebbe is hoping you grab here. That whole metaphor of how far God is about Chachma is really only a description of what we don't know. Right? It's a description of what we...
Human Chokhmah or godly Chokhmah?
No, all Chachma.
All Chokhmah.
Really, which as I said, complicates things, but we'll get back to that. The Alter Rebbe is saying that this is really just a metaphor for what we don't know. In other words, like this. There's things you know. Then there's things you don't know. But when, like I said at the beginning of the class, to really know that you don't know something, you have to know how far exactly it is beyond what I can know. In other words, the not knowing is always relative to what I do know. I'll give you a metaphor for this in a second. The Alter Rebbe is saying is that when we describe God as being beyond what we can know, at a level of 5 removes, right? That is really only a description of the most we can understand of how we don't understand Him. Did you follow what I just said?
No, we don't understand.
Again, the 5 levels of remove, right? The distance between an action to wisdom, between the asiya to the maisa to chachma, right? That distance of five removes, as the Alter Rebbe described it, we may have thought that is an accurate description of how much we don't know God. To what extent do I not know God? To the extent that a single action is removed from a chachma, from wisdom. That's the extent to which I don't know God. Comes the Alter Rebbe and says, no. You don't know God much more than you are able to perceive. In other words, the extent to which you do not know Him is far beyond what you have the ability to recognize. In other words, we have exceeded not just what we know, we have exceeded what we don't know as well. Right? We are beyond not just what we know, we are beyond the ability to make metaphors for what we don't know. The Alter Rebbe is basically saying that in the human experience, the most yesh ma'ayins, the most infinite removes you can fit in is around 5. That's about as much as the greatest human mind, the greatest human wisdom can understand. And how far is God beyond a human being? Infinitely more than the greatest remove we can understand. Beyond wisdom, pardon me, not beyond
This
human
is the
wisdom.
infinitude of not knowing. So that means we're infinite in something.
This is a truly...
It's the same thing. It's like you go in a circle, you turn left and right. You're the same path.
Not knowing, first of all, not knowing is not something that you have. Not knowing is something that you don't have.
Right.
So we are not infinite in anything, right? We're infinite in... We're not infinite. We're the opposite. Everything else is infinite. We're not infinite. The something that we don't have. It's a shlila, right? Shelal, it's a negation. It's a negation of what we have. So not only do we not know God, not only do we not know God, right? But God is really beyond the realm even of our not knowing. That is what the Alter Rebbe is saying. right? As he'll say inside in a moment. He says, Rak mipnei. So the Alter Rebbe is basically, so the Alter Rebbe says, so if God is really infinitely removed, then why even provide the metaphor? Right? What's the point of saying the single action to the wisdom, right? Just say we can't understand, right? If the metaphor doesn't capture it, why even have the metaphor? Right? So the Alter Rebbe, Rak mipnei she'ein b'nivraim keach lahasig, because only because the creation does not have the ability to comprehend, Rak ha'ishtalshelos me'madregas ha'chachma, except the things that derive from wisdom. All we understand is derived from Chachma, is derived from wisdom. Shehidei Shisam, because wisdom is the beginning of everything, of our reality. L'madrega Asiya Hashvala, and down to the level of the Hashvela, down to the low level of action. L'kach anu oimrim, therefore we say, Shelagabi HaKadosh Baruch Hu neshavas madregas HaChachma k'madregas Asiya Mabash. Therefore we say that compared to God, the level of wisdom is like the level of action, that to him they're the same. Dahainu leimar, which is to say, one second before I go forward. In other words, when we say Kulam b'chachma asisa, right, the verse from King David we were talking about before, and we say that it compares chachma to asiya, we're saying that the point of that comparison, of comparing wisdom to action, and saying that to God they're the same, they're both that action is as distant from wisdom as wisdom is from God. The reason we say that is because that's the greatest distance really that we can comprehend. Right? That's why that's what it says in Tehillim. The Alter Rebbe is saying, but really God's distance from wisdom is much greater than what we can comprehend. Right?
For him, it's not distant.
So in other words, for the Alter Rebbe, it's distant. No, he's saying...
No, for God, it's not distant.
Oh, what do you mean
The
for
distance
God?
that we see, like from Chochmah to Maaseh,
Correct.
for him, it's not distant.
Correct, that's the point, right? Chachma is like Maaseh, that's the point. They collapse, right? Wisdom and action are at the same level by him. But what we're saying is really even something more than that. What we're saying is something more than that, right? What we're saying is that that's the greatest leveling that we can understand. In other words, that Chachma should be like action. Really, if you think about it, that's the greatest... The highest infinite you can be that we can understand, that we can even understand how we don't understand it, is an infinite that sees wisdom and action as the same. But God is actually much more infinite than leveling those two things. In other words, Chachma hitting Asiya, those two things becoming equal, is only just the first part of his infinite infinitude. That's not even a chidush. That's not even a kunz. It's not even a great achievement for God's infinitude. That the two should be absolutely equal.
Why is that hard to grasp? I mean, if God is one,
yeah,
then everything is one. No matter what you're going to say, it's still one.
What do you mean?
The chokhmah, the asiya, everything is one. Is one. There's no separation between anything. He may have many different.
Say again.
If I hear you correctly, you're saying it's a challenge in that because everything is Hashem Einay B'Vadei.
Right. Not only that, Hashem Echad.
So what is, I don't understand, so what does Hashem Echad have to do with what I said? Just one second, I haven't figured out.
You're trying to say, I mean, he has that wisdom and he had that asiyah. For him it's the same. Of course it's the same, because he's one.
No, but where do you think the difference between Chachma and Asiyah comes from?
With
Chachma
God,
and
no
Maaseh.
difference.
So you're saying that something exists that God didn't create? Or you're saying that he created something that he doesn't have?
No, he created for us different level, different things. But for him,
I think it's saying that
the difference... Yeah.
Is your question basically saying if Hashem is one thing, one entity, and ain't there's nothing but Hashem. So everything's part of Hashem, and therefore Asiya and Chachma it's all part of Hashem.
By definition.
There's no separation.
Right. But listen, that's not correct though.
No, I'm clarifying the question because I think that what you're saying is that exactly that. That it isn't correct to assume that there's a separation, but the fact that there's a distance in the way that we comprehend a certain element is where the distance is. It's not. That's what
Eyal's saying. That's what Eyal's saying.
But I think that what you're asking is how is there a distance if everything is. It's all one entity. There's nothing but a
So listen. The distance between Chachma and Asiyah that we're describing in the Neshama is a distance that comes from Hashem, obviously. Right? In other words...
In our eyes.
Right.
No.
And you can mix between the two. That's what he is trying to...
No, not in our eyes. Not in our eyes. Chachma and Maisa are two different things that God creates. They're two different things that He creates. Right? They're two different emanations of Hashem. I'm glad that you're bringing this up because this is the gist of what we're saying. Really, we're not there yet. We're not there at the point where we have to grapple with this issue. But that is part of all of what we're discussing. In other words, you're right. What we're going to say is that it goes back to what I was saying before, that we're discussing right now how Hashem is infinitely removed from His wisdom, right? Which makes it sound like the things because He's so far removed, it makes it sound like the things in our world and the differences between them basically just happen at a very far distance from Hashem, right? The Alter Rebbe is actually trying to argue the exact opposite, right? The Alter Rebbe is using all of this we're going to use this, believe it or not, to get around really to the opposite perspective, which is that all of these differences and all of these things that Hashem emanates, His chachma and His ava, right, His wisdom, His love, all these different levels, all of these different things are one with Him, but they are still different. That's where we're heading.
Discussion that we were talking one time about Rambam and Ramban. That's what they were saying, that, one is saying that wisdom is separate of Him.
No, the Maharal and the Rambam you're thinking of. Right. It is, you're right, it is related. It's very related. Very good. Good memory. It's very, very related. That was back at the beginning of Mitzvah Hamanas Alakus. So we're talking about... it's all relative. It's all relative. You're right, it is very related.
Reach a certain age, you celebrate that kind of memory.
That's the only thing I know. That's what I remember.
I'm almost there with you, man.
No, it is related. You're right. It is related. And the two, you're right. You're exactly right. Should we, how much time do we have? 5 minutes? No. We have time. We have enough time to do this very quickly, right? If you'll recall, as Eyal does, back to Mitzvah Hamanas Alakus. This was the last mimer and the beginning of the last thing we learned, before we started learning Tanya, all the way back, right?
I was 8.
This is like the distance from us to the beginning of Hamanas Alakus is like the distance of Asiya to Chachma. So we go back to that discussion. What was the discussion there? Very, very, very briefly. And frankly, the reason I didn't bring this up in the first place is because I didn't want to do it too early because I think it confuses things a little bit. But what was the discussion there? What was the debate? The debate was essentially between the Maharal and the Rambam. The Rambam says God and His wisdom are absolutely one, as one simple thing, right? Which is what our 3 chapters here in Tanya are about, right? The Maharal, speaking in the name of Kabbalah, says that God and His wisdom are absolutely separate, right? And then the whole rest of Hamanas Alakus was the pshara, right? Was the compromise, was explaining how Chassidus says both of these things are true. God and His wisdom are both absolutely separate and absolutely one, right? That's exactly the point the Alter Rebbe is working towards here. So in other words, don't get too focused on what we're saying earlier in Tanya, that nothing other than Hashem exists, which is for sure true, or on what we're saying here now, that His Chachma is infinitely removed from Him and totally outside of Him, right? The reason we're saying this is, here's the Seder HaDvarim, right? Here's how this part of the Tanya goes. The Alter Rebbe spends the first 7 chapters explaining how nothing other than Hashem exists. Then, in chapter 8, last week's chapter, the Alter Rebbe takes a turn, which at first you don't really see in the text itself why the Alter Rebbe is doing this. The Alter Rebbe suddenly starts talking about pshitus, the divine simplicity, right? How God has no parts, which is really what we're discussing here, right? His Chachma is infinitely removed from Him. In other words, His Chachma isn't a part. It doesn't constitute a difference in Hashem. Hashem is infinitely above all these divisions, right? Like you were saying, Hashem is one, right? Simplicity of Hashem. That's what we're discussing here. Why does the Alter Rebbe suddenly bring up the simplicity of Hashem? Because he is going to go back to that discussion we had in Mitzvah Hamanas Alakus. It's really back to the future, because the Alter Rebbe was before the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek was working off of Tanya, so we're learning them in the opposite order, really, that they happen chronologically. But the Alter Rebbe is going to take these 2 ideas, the first 7 chapters, which is the Achdus Hashem, The oneness of Hashem. In other words, nothing other than Hashem exists. And what we're discussing now, the pshitus of Hashem, the absolute simplicity of Hashem. And we're going to look at how these two things seem to contradict. It seems like you can't have both. If everything is Hashem, it should collapse into, God forbid, into pantheism, into terrible idolatry. Everything is Hashem. Start bowing down to tables, God forbid. Everything is everything because nothing exists other than Hashem. So everything is God, right? On the other hand, you have absolute divine simplicity and pshitus, which says that nothing is Hashem except Hashem, because what thing is as one as Hashem? Nothing can impinge upon, nothing can be part of that oneness, right? The table and Hashem are completely separate. How could you say there's any connection between the two, right? That's divine simplicity. God forbid, even the source of 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 the table, which is in Chachma, has absolutely nothing to do with Hashem, right? As we're saying now, right? Hashem is infinitely removed, right? More than we can comprehend, in fact. And then the Alter Rebbe is going to say, which is the piece de resistance, the finale of the second part of Tanya, which is that these two things are not a contradiction. Achdus Hashem and Pshitus Hashem are not a contradiction, and in fact they work together in the system of Chabad. In the Alter Rebbe system, these two things are both true. Hashem is absolutely simple and removed, but he is also absolutely one with everything, such that nothing exists other than Hashem. Right? Both of these things are true. Both of these things are true. Let's read just a little bit further before we finish off for tonight. Where was I here? Dahainu, second line of 953. Yeah, Dahainu loymar shehu ram v'nisa v'nayla ilu rav ma'od ma'od maderek sachachma, which is to say that God is exalted at a great distance, a great distance from the level of wisdom. You cannot ascribe to God anything which is ascribed to wisdom. Even at a very lofty and sublime way. In other words, you cannot there is no process by which you can take wisdom and turn it into something that applies to Hashem. That's what an infinite remove means, right? To be infinitely distant, the way we're describing, and Hashem is infinitely distant, more than we can comprehend, right? To be that far removed means that no amount of wisdom, no matter how refined, no matter how abstract that wisdom is, no wisdom can grasp it. Kagoin leimar, Allah, for example, to say about him, right? What's the Alter Rebbe's example? So beautiful. The Alter Rebbe's example is, what can you not say about God? What is this refined description of wisdom that you say cannot apply to God? You cannot say about him that it is impossible for any creation above or below to understand him. That's called ascribing chachma to God. Right? Nothing can understand him. No creation below, no creation above can understand God. This is to bring God into chachma in a way that is not correct. God is infinitely beyond chachma. It is demeaning to God. It brings God down to say that no one can understand him. It brings him down to say that no one can understand him. Why? Because comprehension is refers to a matter of wisdom and intellect. About which we say that it is possible to comprehend it or impossible to comprehend it, depending on the depth of the idea. In other words, when we say, I can't understand multivariable calculus, right? I can't understand it. I can't understand multivariable calculus. What does that mean? It means multivariable calculus is a thing which can be understood. Some people have the ability to understand it. I don't have the ability to understand it. In other words, it's within the realm of understanding. Again, we have this idea of the negation of understanding, right? That God is beyond even the negation. So when I say I don't understand God, it's a negation. I'm saying he's beyond my understanding. What could be wrong with that? But according to everything we've learned tonight, where we say that God is so far above Chachma that we can't even understand how far above Chachma he is, right? Then when I say I can't understand God, it's actually demeaning and degrading. It actually brings that God down from what he truly is. Because multivariable calculus is a thing you don't understand. And you can understand how you don't understand it. God is not even an understandable thing. God is infinitely removed from being within that category of things that are understandable. And in fact, because we are so limited to being understanding souls, because we operate so much and are so bound to the realm of understanding, to the realm of Chachma, because we live in a Chachma universe, so to speak, we don't even understand the extent to which, we cannot understand the extent to which he cannot be understood. Which is why to say he can't be understood is degrading. It's an insult, right? Multivariable calculus is something you don't understand, right? God is not something you don't understand, right? How do you measure that not understanding? Who does understand? Who can understand? God is not, in other words, as he's going to say, we're not going to read it this week, we'll read it at the beginning of next week, I think, because it'll be good for our review. But as he's going to say next week, God is not even in the realm, he's not even in the dimension of understanding, right? It's like saying, we're going to read next week, because the Alter Rebbe famously says that to say you cannot understand God is like saying an idea is so abstract that I can't touch it with my fingers, right? In other words, you can never touch an idea with your fingers, right? The most coarse, the lowest, the simplest idea you can't touch with your fingers, right? The fact that you can't touch it has nothing to do with the abstraction or the difficulty or the refinement of the idea, right? You can't touch it because it's not a touchable thing. So too God in comparison to understanding. The reason you don't understand God is not because he's so abstract. That's also true. But the reason you don't understand God is not because he's very abstract or refined. It's because understanding is not a thing which intersects with the reality that God is. The same way your fingers don't intersect with the reality of an idea. They're two totally separate realms, and we can't even comprehend how separate that realm is. And much more, God willing, on all of this next week. Sorry?
To say that you cannot understand God brings God down is another way of saying that in some way, shape, or form, we otherwise would have superior knowledge. And that's what brings God down. Because otherwise, in other words, it's almost like giving us too much credit.
Why?
To say, oh, well, I can understand this or that, but I can't understand that.
Right.
Okay? And that sort of bestows on the person a higher level of understanding. It's like, well, I don't understand your behavior.
Right.
Okay? And which sort of establishes a hierarchy of understanding.
Right.
Okay, I think it sounds like that's the context.
Well, we're jumping off the hierarchy. In other words, there certainly is a hierarchy of understanding, right? There certainly is a hierarchy.
I'm saying to say that would bring God down is because that would in some way bestow on us a capacity to understand.
Exactly, that's what I mean. Yes. No, it doesn't bring God himself down. No, absolutely. When I say it brings God down, what I mean to say is that it's bad behavior on our part. That's what I mean. I don't mean that it actually. No. I agree. We're on the same page. I think we're on the same page.
That's just a part of our understanding.
What is?
Can't do multivariable calculus.
All of this.
Absolutely. But in what direction are we moving? We're moving towards a recognition. The greatest possible recognition of our lack of understanding. That's the direction we're moving, right? In other words, yes, it is all part of the process, but the conclusion of the process is not knowing God. In fact,
the same as our interaction between us ourselves.
What do you mean?
How do we interact?
Yeah.
How do we recognize to interact?
What do you mean? Like a human being, you're saying?
Between human beings.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there's something there for us just to
be able to interact with each other. It's a similar thing.
You're saying that there has to be some sort of recognition in order to have a relationship at all. There has to be some sort of recognition. No, I agree, and Chassidus agrees as well. The thing that Chassidus says, though, what the Alter Rebbe would say in his system, is that initial recognition is not intellectual, it's a faith recognition, which is a totally different discussion. So far we've been talking about chachma, about wisdom, but the truth is that chachma, there is something other than chachma in a human being, which Alter Rebbe discusses at great length in the first part of Tanya, which is called faith. And faith is a transcendent connection that is, so to speak, a direct connection to God, by no medium, by no means, right? Unlike wisdom, by which you know something through something else, right? I know multivariable calculus through acquiring information about it, which is connected to other information I know, and slowly my wisdom in multivariable calculus grows, right? There is something in the soul. The soul has a module buried deep in the firmware somewhere in there, right? The soul has an ability to have God all at once, not intellectually, because it is a piece of
That
God.
implies we have something different.
What do you mean?
We have something beyond intellect.
We do, absolutely. That's exactly what we're saying. There is something beyond intellect. So in other words, when the Alter Rebbe says that the soul is a piece of God, he means it in a very practical way. He's not being very airy-fairy. What he's saying is that literally, you know how the way I think about it, which is very, very coarse, in fact, it's probably better not to mention. But the whole idea that the soul is a piece of God, what's the purpose of that idea? In other words, in Alter Rebbe's whole scheme, it has many practical effects. That idea, that effect plays out in many practical ways. One of the ways that idea plays out practically is that the soul is able to relate to God not by going out, but actually by going in. In other words, the soul, because it is a piece of God, so to speak, just in itself, just by being itself, has a relationship with Hashem, right? But that's far beyond the scope of what we're discussing here, because what Alter Rebbe is really doing is he's talking about understanding. So what we have capacities beyond understanding is not really relevant here, because we're relating Hashem to understanding. That's the first part of the disclaimer. The second part of the disclaimer is that in the first part of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says that godly faith and that godly soul, where does that faith express? Also in Chachma. So in other words, maybe what we're saying here to some extent includes faith as well, in some way or another. It's a tzarich iyun, mystery, needs more research. But good evening.